The farmer wiped the sweat off his brow. The day had been long, and his heart was heavy. His horse, the one that had carried him through endless fields, through storms and sunshine, had taken its last breath that morning. There was nothing he could do but bury it. With his shovel, he dug deep into the earth. The soil was damp, resisting him with every stroke, as if the land itself did not want to take the horse away. But he pressed on. When the hole was deep enough, he rolled the horse's lifeless body inside, covering it carefully, whispering a quiet farewell. That night, as he lay in bed, exhaustion should have overtaken him. But sleep did not come easy. The wind outside whistled through the trees, creating eerie sounds. He turned over, pulling the blanket higher, telling himself it was just the usual night noises. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. A slow, rhythmic clopping sound echoed through the night. The sound of a horse walking just outside his window. His heart stopped. The horse was dead. He buried it himself. He placed every shovelful of dirt over its body. Yet the hoofbeats continued. He sat up, listening, barely breathing. The footsteps circled the house once, twice. Then they stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. The farmer swallowed hard. He had lived on this land for years. He knew every creature that roamed it, every sound the night could bring. This wasn't normal. Summoning courage, he swung his legs over the bed, grabbed his lantern, and stepped outside. The cold air hit his skin like ice. The moon was full, casting long shadows over the ground. Nothing. The yard was empty. His barn doors were shut. The wind rustled the trees, but there was no movement. No horse. No hoof prints. He exhaled sharply. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks on him. Maybe the grief of the day was settling in strange ways. Shaking his head, he turned back toward the house. Then he heard it again. Right behind him, the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. A presence. A shadow. Slowly, he turned his head, and there it stood. A horse. But not just any horse. His horse. The same dull mane, the same deep, intelligent eyes. But something was wrong. Its coat, once glossy and healthy, was now coated in dirt, patches of earth clinging to its legs as if it had just crawled out of the grave. Its eyes were dark. Too dark. The farmer's breath came in short gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The horse took a step forward. He stumbled backward, his lantern shaking in his hands. "You're dead," he whispered, his voice barely more than air. The horse tilted its head. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it stepped closer. The ground beneath it trembled. The farmer ran. He didn't know where he was going. His body acted before his mind could catch up. He bolted for the barn, slamming the doors behind him. Darkness swallowed him whole, but he didn't stop moving. He backed up against the wall, chest heaving, listening. Silence. Maybe it was gone. Maybe. A loud, hollow bang rattled the barn doors. The sound of hooves against wood. Then again. And again. Something was trying to get in. The farmer clenched his fists. This was his land. His home. Whatever was out there, it wasn't his horse anymore. He grabbed his shotgun from the tool rack, his fingers trembling around the barrel. He swallowed, steadied his breath, and threw the doors open. Nothing. The night was still. The wind had stopped. The moon hung overhead, a silent witness. Then he saw them. Hoof prints in the dirt. Fresh. Leading away from the barn. Back toward the grave. Heart pounding, he followed. The prints led him through the field, past the old oak tree, to the very spot where he had buried his horse just hours before. The ground was disturbed. The dirt was loose, shifted, as if something had crawled out. His stomach turned. He dropped to his knees, pressing his hands into the soil. It was soft. Too soft. He dug, clawing at the earth, his nails filling with dirt. Then he touched something. Something smooth. Something cold. Something that should not have been there. He yanked it up. The breath left his lungs. It was a horseshoe. Rusted. Old. Not the one his horse had worn. His mind raced. If this wasn't his horse's grave, then whose was it? And then, behind him, the sound of breathing. Deep. Low. The ground trembled. He turned. And saw. The farmer turned, his breath catching in his throat, his muscles locking in place. The night was still, unnaturally silent. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, each inhale sharp and shallow, each exhale a whisper of fear against the stillness. But he knew he wasn't alone. The presence behind him was undeniable, the air thick with something unseen but deeply felt, something ancient, something watching. His fingers tightened around the rusted horseshoe, his palm damp with sweat, dirt clinging to his skin. The moon cast an eerie glow across the disturbed grave, the edges of the mound now crumbling under his touch. He swallowed hard and forced himself to move, slowly rising to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. He had to know. He had to see what had come back from the earth. His eyes lifted, scanning the darkness beyond the grave. And there it was, the horse, or at least, what was left of it. Its body stood unnaturally still, its head lowered, the moonlight catching the jagged edges of its exposed ribs where flesh had rotted away. Its coat, once smooth and shining, was now mottled with decay, clumps of dirt hanging from its frame. Its hooves were cracked, caked in thick mud, and its tail swayed ever so slightly, moving without the wind. But the worst part, the thing that sent ice-cold fear shooting through the farmer's veins, was its eyes. They were hollow. Not just dark, not just empty. They were gaping voids, black pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. And yet, somehow, they were looking at him, seeing him. The farmer's breath hitched. His instinct screamed at him to flee, but his legs wouldn't obey. His mind spun, grasping for logic, for reason, but none existed. This was not natural. This was not right. The horse was dead. He had buried it. He had put it in the ground himself. But now here it was, standing before him, breathing, watching, waiting. Then it moved. Not a normal movement, not the slow, steady shifting of a living creature. It jerked, its legs stiff, its body swaying unnaturally as it took a step forward. Then another. The earth beneath it did not stir. No hoofprints marked its path. It was moving, but it left no trace. The farmer stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose rock. He barely managed to keep his balance, his heartbeat pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. His hand shook as he lifted the rusted horseshoe, his only weapon, though he didn't know what good it would do against something that had already defied death. The horse took another step. Its head twitched, almost like it was listening, its ears shifting toward something unseen. Then, without warning, it opened its mouth. The sound that came from it was not a whinny, not a neigh. It was something else entirely. A scream. A low, guttural, inhuman wail that didn't belong in this world. It started deep, reverberating through the air like distant thunder, before rising higher, higher, until it became a shriek so sharp it felt like knives digging into the farmer's skull. He dropped the horseshoe. His hands flew to his ears, pressing hard, trying to block out the noise, but it was inside him. The sound crawled beneath his skin, seeping into his bones, rattling his teeth. He stumbled, his knees buckling. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring, but he barely felt it. His mind was consumed by the sound, by the unearthly wail that filled the night, filled the world. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence. The farmer gasped for breath, his chest heaving, his ears ringing. His hands trembled as he lowered them, his entire body shaking with exhaustion, with fear. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his head. The horse was gone, vanished. The ground where it had stood was undisturbed. No prints, no broken twigs, nothing. It was as if it had never been there. But the farmer knew better. He struggled to his feet, his legs weak beneath him. His mind screamed at him to run, to get inside, to lock the doors, to forget this night had ever happened. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Something was wrong. His eyes drifted back to the disturbed grave. The hole he had started digging was deeper now, as if something had been trying to crawl out. And in the center, half buried in the loose soil, was something new, something that had not been there before. A second horseshoe, not rusted, not old, fresh, new, still attached to a skeletal hoof. The farmer's breath hitched. His blood ran cold. This wasn't his horse's grave. It never had been. Something else was buried here. And now it was awake. The farmer stood frozen, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His mind fought to comprehend what he was seeing, but every rational thought slipped through his fingers like sand. The skeletal hoof, half buried in the disturbed grave, was not from his horse. It was something older, something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath the soil for far longer than he could imagine. The fresh horseshoe attached to it gleamed under the moonlight, as if it had been placed there recently, deliberately. His hands trembled as he took a step back, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to put as much distance between himself and this grave as possible. But his body wouldn't move fast enough. His limbs felt sluggish, as if something unseen held him in place, forcing him to bear witness to what came next. The ground beneath the hoof shuddered. A deep, hollow sound rumbled from within the earth, a vibration that seemed to pulse through the very air around him. It wasn't the sound of shifting dirt or settling soil. It was something else, something alive. The farmer's breath hitched in his throat as he watched in horror. The hoof twitched. Then, slowly, agonizingly, it began to rise. A skeletal leg, wrapped in decayed sinew and rotted flesh, pushed its way upward through the dirt. The farmer stumbled back further, his foot catching on a loose rock. He barely managed to stay upright, his wide eyes locked onto the unholy sight before him. More of the creature emerged, inch by inch, clawing its way out of the earth. Then the head appeared. It wasn't his horse. It wasn't any horse he had ever seen. The skull was elongated, cracked, and splintered with age, its eye sockets deep and cavernous. Jagged teeth jutted out from its exposed jaw, some missing, others worn down to sharp, uneven nubs. The remains of tattered skin clung to its face in patches, stretched tight over bone. But the worst part, the thing that made the farmer's blood turn to ice, was its eyes. Unlike his own horse, whose eyes had been hollow voids, these eyes burned. Deep within the skull, a sickly green glow pulsed, flickering like distant firelight. The farmer felt his chest tighten, a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal, something that reached into the very marrow of his being and whispered of doom. The creature fully emerged now, standing before him, impossibly tall. Its legs, twisted and malformed, bent in unnatural ways, each joint creaking with the weight of something ancient. Its ribs were exposed, but instead of emptiness within, the same eerie green light pulsed from its core, illuminating the night with an otherworldly glow. The air around it felt thick, heavy, charged with an energy that made the farmer's skin crawl. He wanted to run, to turn and flee into the safety of his home, but his feet were rooted to the ground. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then the creature spoke. The voice did not come from its mouth. Its jaw did not move. Instead, the words seeped into the air like mist, echoing through the silence, vibrating in his very bones. It was deep, guttural, layered with voices overlapping one another, as if multiple souls were trapped within its form, speaking in unison. "You buried one," it rumbled, "but you have disturbed another." The farmer's mind reeled. He had only buried his own horse. There had been nothing else in that grave, just soil, just earth, just the remains of the animal he had loved and lost. But the creature before him spoke with certainty, with a knowing that unsettled him to his core. His lips parted, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his voice lost. The creature took a step forward. The ground did not stir beneath its hooves. It moved as if floating, as if the earth itself dared not touch it. "The debt must be paid," it said. A sudden gust of wind tore through the night, howling through the trees, rattling the branches like brittle bones. The farmer shielded his face, his heart pounding in his chest. When he looked back, the creature was gone. The grave was undisturbed once more. The skeletal hoof, the fresh horseshoe, the unnatural glow, it had all vanished. For a moment, the farmer dared to hope that he had imagined it all, that the night, the exhaustion, the grief had twisted his mind into seeing horrors that weren't real. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye, something small, gleaming in the moonlight. A single rusted horseshoe. His own, the one he had dropped when the nightmare had begun. But now there were symbols etched into the metal, symbols that had not been there before. They glowed faintly, pulsing with that same sickly green light. The farmer's fingers hesitated before reaching down, but the moment his skin touched the metal, a searing pain shot through his hand. He yelped, stumbling back, cradling his palm against his chest. When he dared to look, he saw the marks burned into his flesh, twisting, curling lines forming symbols he could not understand. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. This was not over. This was only the beginning. A low rumble filled the air once more, distant yet unmistakable. It was the sound of hoofbeats. Slow, steady, coming from the darkness beyond the trees. Something was coming, and it was coming for him. The farmer stood frozen, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The sound of the hoofbeats echoed through the trees, steady, deliberate, impossibly heavy. Each step carried with it an unbearable weight, a sense of inevitability that pressed against his chest like a vice. The wind had died completely now, leaving the night unnervingly still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The rusted horseshoe still lay in the dirt before him, pulsing with that unholy green glow. The markings burned into its surface, shifting, as if they were alive. His hand throbbed where he had touched it, the scorched flesh still raw. The strange symbols etched into his skin a permanent reminder that whatever he had disturbed would not let him go so easily. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, to flee from whatever horror was making its way through the darkness. But his feet would not obey. It was as if the very ground beneath him had turned to iron, rooting him in place, forcing him to stand and wait. The hoofbeats grew louder, their rhythmic cadence sending shock waves through his bones. They did not gallop, did not rush, did not hesitate. They moved with the slow, measured patience of something that had all the time in the world, something that knew there was no escape. And then silence. The absence of sound was worse than the hoofbeats themselves. The moment stretched into eternity, the air thick with anticipation, charged with something ancient and unseen. The farmer's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting wildly across the tree line, searching for movement, for a sign, for anything that would tell him where the presence lurked. His heart pounded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill that wrapped around him like a shroud. He knew, with a certainty that burned in his gut, that he was not alone. A whisper, barely more than a breath of wind, brushed against his ear. "Turn around." The voice was not human. It was not of this world. It was layered, distorted, overlapping in a way that made his skin crawl, as if 100 voices spoke at once, their tones twisting together into something unnatural. His body refused to obey. He could feel the weight of a presence behind him now, something towering, something vast, something that radiated a cold so deep it felt like it would seep into his bones and never leave. Every instinct screamed at him to keep his back turned, to pretend he had not heard, to deny whatever was standing just inches away from him. The silence stretched. The thing behind him did not move, did not breathe, did not make a single sound. But he could feel it. He could feel its presence pressing against him, could feel the unbearable weight of unseen eyes burrowing into his skull. His muscles locked, his breath hitched, his fingers twitched at his sides. And then, another whisper, softer this time, almost mocking. "Turn around." It was not a request. It was a command. His body obeyed before his mind could stop it. His head moved slowly, inch by inch, every nerve in his body screaming in protest. The moment his eyes met the thing that stood behind him, the world shifted. The night seemed to stretch, the stars above twisting into unfamiliar patterns, the air vibrating with an energy that was neither alive nor dead. The figure before him was not his horse. It was not anything he could have imagined. It was tall, impossibly so, its elongated limbs bending at angles that defied reason. Its body was draped in what looked like decayed leather, stretched and worn, the texture shifting like smoke, like shadows made tangible. But it was the head that stole his breath, that drove a spear of pure terror through his chest. It was the skull of a horse, ancient and cracked, its jagged teeth bared in a twisted approximation of a grin. The same eerie green light burned in its hollow sockets, flickering like dying embers. And yet, within that unnatural glow, something deeper lurked, something aware, something watching. The creature did not move. It did not blink. It simply stared. And then, slowly, impossibly, it tilted its head. The motion was too smooth, too precise, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. A low, guttural sound rumbled from within its chest, vibrating through the air, through the earth, through the very fabric of reality itself. It was not a growl. It was something older, something more dangerous. The farmer's knees threatened to buckle beneath him, his hands trembling at his sides. He tried to speak, to demand answers, to plead, to beg, but no sound came. His throat had closed, his voice stolen by the sheer presence of the thing before him. The creature took a step forward. The ground did not shift beneath its weight. It moved as if it existed outside of the physical world, its hooves making no sound against the dirt. The cymbals burned into the farmer's palm flared with sudden heat, sending a sharp pain shooting up his arm. He gasped, stumbling back, clutching his hand against his chest. The creature tilted its head further, as if observing, as if studying. And then, finally, it spoke. "You have dug too deep," it said. The words slithered through the air, wrapping around him like unseen tendrils, burrowing into his mind, into his very soul. He did not understand, did not know what it meant. He had only buried his horse. He had not dug for anything else. But the creature continued before he could form a thought. "This land remembers," it said, "and so do we." The farmer's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his pulse hammering in his ears. The creature stepped closer, its skeletal face now inches from his own. The stench of decay, of earth long undisturbed, of something ancient and wrong, filled his nostrils, burning his throat. "The debt must be paid," it whispered. The world spun. The ground tilted beneath him. The air became too thick, too heavy, pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the creature's burning eyes. And then nothing. Silence. Stillness. A void that stretched into eternity. When the farmer awoke, he was lying in his bed. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Birds chirped in the distance, the world alive and unchanged. For a fleeting moment, he thought it had all been a dream, a nightmare born of grief and exhaustion. But then he felt it, the pain. His hand. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted it. The symbols remained, burned into his flesh, their glow now faded but still present, still watching. His stomach twisted. His gaze flickered to the window, to the land beyond. His breath hitched. The grave was gone. The dirt was untouched. No sign of digging, no disturbed soil. No trace that anything had ever been buried there at all. But his horse was still missing. And the hoofbeats had not stopped. They were just waiting for nightfall,